Welcome to the African News Review podcast, where we cut through the noise and get to the truth. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and each week we are here to challenge the biases, prejudices, and misinformation in the Western press about Africa. Using historical context and contemporary insights, we set the record straight and reclaim the narrative. Tune in every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we uncover the real stories and reshape the conversations about Africa. This is the African News Review podcast, reclaiming Africa's narrative, one story at a time. Okay. Yes, greetings, and welcome to another episode of African News Review. And this review is going to take the form of a book review, which we've decided in the course of the year that we'll do at the end of each month. We'll take a book of historical relevance with a contemporary theme, and we basically would have a look at it. So today, without further ado, we're going to be looking at Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind. This book, I can see the comrades is already getting excited.
Yes, sir.
Yes. So Decolonizing the Mind by Ngugi wa Thiong'o was published in 1986 on the James Corey imprint of the Heinemann Press. And it's a book of collection of essays initially given as lectures. And the lectures are themed the language of African literature, the language of African theater, the language of African fiction, the quest of relevance. And the entire book is 148 pages if you count the index. Now, I'll give a brief summary of the book, which I did write down. It's Decolonising the Mind is a powerful collection of essays, like I said earlier, by Kenya's writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, exploring how colonialism used language as a tool of domination, and how reclaiming indigenous languages is essential for true liberation. Ngugi in this book argues that colonialism did not just occupy African lands, but it also invaded African minds by forcing them to abandon their native languages in favor of English, French, and other European languages. He explains that language carries culture, and culture carries values, memories, and a worldview of a people. When African writers and thinkers express themselves in colonial languages, he said, they unconsciously reinforce colonial structures and alienate themselves from their own community. Throughout this book, which we'll go to, Ngugi shares his personal journey explaining why he decided to stop writing in English and instead write in his native Kikuyu language. He critiques the westernized African elite for perpetuating cultural imperialism and calls for African writers, artists, and intellectuals to prioritize indigenous language in their works, educational system, and national discourse. Your initial thoughts, comrade?
Well, as he says elsewhere, that European colonialism hijacked Africa's economies, and by hijacking the economies, you hijack the politics, and it also hijacked the culture and the language. Now, when we talk about to what extent has Africa been decolonized, we had formal flag independence, where the European leaders were replaced by Africans. Yet the economy is still controlled by the former colonial powers and the new power, of course, which is the United States and its allies, such as Japan, for example. What about the culture? What about the language? We never even attempted to decolonize that, to take that back. As you know, and I'm sure, we're familiar with the English colonies because we are products of the English colonies. But the French even had it work. But during the colonial regime, you had to abandon your name, your African name, and you had to abandon your African language and culture. And in order to be rewarded, recognized, elevated, promoted, accepted, embraced, you had to embrace the language of the colonizing power. And when you do that, you have to repudiate and reject your own language and your own culture. But by rejecting your language and your culture, you're actually rejecting yourself as well. And you're rejecting fellow Africans. And that is why language has always been very important to Ngugi. He said even when he was writing in English, when he attended a conference in Uganda in 1962, at that time he was really bothered. He saw the contradiction. That conference was a conference about Africans who were expressing their literature through the English language.
English.
And he was complaining. He said because automatically it excluded Africans who engaged in literature but just happened to be using African languages. So he's been bothered about that aspect for a very long time. And that is what you just summarized in your introduction.
Thank you. So I'll open the gambits with his take in the introduction to the book. He said, the misleading stock interpretation of African realities have been popularized by the Western media, which likes to deflect people from seeing that imperialism is still the root cause of many problems in Africa. Unfortunately, many intellectuals have fallen victims, and incurably so, to that scheme, and they are unable to see the divide and rule colonial origins of explaining any difference of intellectual outlook or any political clashes in terms of the ethnic origins of the actor. No man or woman can choose their biological nationalities. The conflict between people cannot be explained in terms of that which is fixed, the invariables, that is. Otherwise, the problems between the two peoples would always be same at all times and places. So, invariably, what he's saying here is, if the language is stagnant, you can't express any cultural realities in the colonial languages. How could you truly claim to be free?
Exactly.
Or what do you?
Well, even beyond that, because, for example, and I think for audience, it's easier to think of it this way. Think of China, major civilization. Why should China embrace English? Why should China embrace French? Why? Think about that. So if that's not acceptable to China, why should it be acceptable to Africa and Africa or Japan? Ancient cultures and civilizations. They engage fully in the global economy. They engage in English or any other of the European languages. They accept from Europe, from the United States, what they want to accept and integrate it into the Chinese or Japanese culture. With us, we start upside down. We start off with English identification, English concepts, English thoughts, English concepts of the state, English concepts of governance, English concept of what it means to be quote unquote civilized. And then we say, what from Africa will we pull and integrate? And the same thing for the ones who were victimized by French imperialism. We start off with the idea, our concept of the universe is French. And then after we start from that premise, which one of our African attributes are we going to allow into the house? Can you imagine? Can you imagine the Chinese or Japanese operating that way? So to me, it goes beyond just language. It's the concept of the world, the concept of the universe, the concept of yourself, and what role you play in that universe. So for the Chinese, the universe is China. It is the interest of China and what will help China that I will now allow into the house from outside. The same approach for Japan, right? You can't say the same for Africa. How can Africans be asking themselves, what aspect of Africa should I tolerate? That's what you're saying, you know? So then it means you've already surrendered or you've yielded too much ground even before the battle has begun. You see? And that's a problem. That's a problem whether you accept and Ngugi's premise or not, that is important for us to re-embrace our indigenous languages. Even if you don't want to accept that, I think it's going to be difficult for you to argue against the analogy that I just presented. China starts off as China and then says, I will choose what I want from the rest of the world. On the other hand, we start off by rejecting Africa. That's a problem.
It is a problem. I mean, he goes further. He says in the quote in here, he says, there are many inputs into the actual formation of a line of argument. And even the formal arrangement, example, i.e. a book, the very words we use are a product of our collective history. So he's saying, now you've written a book, but you've written it in English. Will the power of your history be described accurately in that language? The answer is no. So again, or is that not a watered down version of who you are as a person?
Of course, absolutely. So somebody might say that he's right, he's correct. Implementing it may create challenges. That's what somebody playing the devil's advocate might say that. That yes, it's true. If we individually, each of us, think about our African languages, the stories we grew up hearing, and he discusses that too as he was growing up, history, right? Oral tradition, oral literature, you could say.
Tradition.
Each time the story or a story was told, it would be transformed, right? These stories were not just lifeless stories. The stories evolved. There would be some basic characters, right? Whether it's the tortoise, whether it's the hare, whether it's the snake,
or the fox,
whether it's the 10-eyed monster, right? But they would be involved in different types of challenges and engagements, you see? So the language is also evolving. And it's impossible to capture those stories in any other language but the language in which it is originated, right? So we have to accept that. And if you're going to have translations, the translations will never be superior to the original story itself, because there's some things that cannot be translated into other languages, you know, even much more challenging a non-African language. You see, I can see translations from African language to another African language. Even then, you might miss something, but there would be much more familiarity than opposed to a European language. And the translation would be much more closer, you see? So somebody would say, okay, so why don't you master the European language so that you, the speaker of the African language, can translate it yourself? Why don't you be the translator? If you mastered French, why don't you write in French? Because you would be translating that language. You see? So what is the problem with that? The problem is that what he's saying is that we are not promoting our African languages, meaning that even those stories that used to evolve, that contain so much historical knowledge, by not promoting those languages, you're killing that stream of history. So it's not just talking about not being able to translate into a European language, but he's talking about the other side as well. We are not only not promoting the African language, we are attacking them. We are undermining them. He spoke about how when he was growing up, if you were caught speaking Gikuyu, his language, in high school, you would be whipped. Corporal punishment.
Yep.
Because you're not accepting English.
A form of rebellion.
Exactly.
Okay, so when it comes to, he says in the chapter 1, the language of African literature, he says, and I read, on one hand, is imperialism in its colonial and neo-colonial phases continuously press-ganging the African hand to the plow, to turn the soil over and to put blinkers on him, to make him view the path ahead only as determined for him by the master armed with the Bible and the sword. In other words, imperialism continues to control the economy, the politics, and cultures of Africa. On the other hand, and pitted against it are the ceaseless struggles of African people to liberate their economic, politics, and culture from the European American-based stranglehold to usher in a new era of true communal self-regulation and self-determination. So what do you read into that in terms of, we do hear every week in terms of media, giving historical context to stories that we find in the Western press. Now, we also have some of us who write for these organizations, but we write in the language of those organizations. So effectively, we're what Frantz Fanon will call black skin and white marks, we're the face of imperialism. So what he's saying here is, now we've put our talent to the use for the imperialist. How do we bulk against this kind of homegrown challenge, as it were? Just taking a quick break here on the African News Review podcast, but don't go anywhere. If you're enjoying our deep dive into the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we're here to debunk the myths and bring you the truth about Africa. Want to help spread the word? Share this podcast with your friends and leave us a review. It goes a long way in helping others discover the real Africa. Without further ado, let's get back to setting the record straight.
Well, actually, to that, I would say even he himself acknowledges, I think in his in the essay, toward the end, that the language itself alone is not going to be sufficient. The ideology, of course, is very important. If you're allowed to speak as much Gikuyu as you want, or any other African language, and you still fully embrace the ideology of imperialism, then that is of no use either. It has to go hand in hand. Understand your history. And I think he would answer a question like that by saying, yes, but by knowing your language and accepting your language, you would also then know your history. You would know that if you're Gikuyu, the land was taken from you by the Europeans. And you were then forced to pay taxes. And in order to earn money to pay taxes, you ended up working on the land that used to belong to you. But now you're selling your labor to the European who displace you from the land. So I think, and obviously later on, when he gets to, the drama and the plays, he proves that, in fact, he's not only talking about language. You see, when he says language, it actually means culture, he means history, he means rebellion. So I think language, in his case, the word should be seen a little more in a bigger, broader aspect. Not just, I speak French, I speak Russian, I speak English, I speak Portuguese. No. You have to ask yourself, why is it that somebody speaks a particular language, right? And then everything that comes with that answer will also give you the answer to the question, why was the issue of language so important and still is very important to Ngugi wa Thiong'o?
So I would enjoy, I would enjoy people to actually get the book. It's written in 1986 and very much still relevant. It's Decolonizing the Mind by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So, still on literature, he writes, it seems it is the fate of Africa to have a destiny always decided around conference tables in the metropolises of the Western world. Her submergence from self-governing communities into colonies was decided in Berlin, and her more recent transitions into neo-colonials along the same boundaries was negotiated around the same tables in London, Paris, Brussels, and Lisbon. The Berlin-drawn divisions, which Africa is still living, was obviously economic and political, despite the claims of the Bible-wielding diplomats. It's also cultural. Berlin in 1884 saw the division of Africa into different languages of the European powers. The African countries as colonies, and even today as neo-colonies, came to be defined and define themselves in terms of the languages of Europe, English-speaking, French-speaking, or Portuguese-speaking African countries.
All right, so
what's your take on that?
Well, the important thing you spoke about was that Africa's fate being determined behind a conference table. And of course, for people that are not familiar with the Berlin Conference, that was the conference in 1884, from November 1884 to February 1885, where the European powers of the day, primarily England, France, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Spain, decided to partition Africa into their spheres, into their colonies, European colonies. And the primary motive was to avoid potential wars between Europeans, wars for these territories in Africa. They were after the minerals, raw resources, they were after land, and they were after cheap African labor. And obviously, they were industrializing, so they wanted Africans to become consumers of their manufactured products. So they met, Africans had no knowledge that Europeans were meeting in Berlin and deciding that you now belong to France, you belong to Britain, you belong to Belgium, Spain, Portugal, and so forth. So you had the colonial experience. Colonialism was just a slightly more humane form of slavery. Although in some parts of Africa, no difference. In the Belgian colony, of course, where they were cutting off the hands and feet of people that did not produce enough rubber or deliver enough ivory. That was the same or even worse than some aspects of slavery. And then at the end, when nationalism particularly accelerated after World War II, and African countries are now fighting for their independence, how was the issue resolved? Once again, they ended up going, the nationalist independence leaders ended up going to resolve the issue behind a conference table in Europe. So for many of the former British colonies, Lancaster, they're very familiar with Lancaster House in London, where the former British colonies, the leaders of the independence movements would go there. They would be sitting on one side, on the other side, the European colonialist, and they would negotiate independence. Now, if you are negotiating for independence in the capital city of the colonizer, who is in charge? Let's think about it. How is the outcome going to be? So it's not surprising that these so-called independents, negotiated primarily in the 1960s, have not yielded the benefits of independence to a single African country. The United States, some people forget, because the United States is such a global power, that the United States was once a colony of Britain. People forget that. So did George Washington and the other independence fighters, did they go to London to negotiate with the British monarchy about independence for the United States? No, of course not. They had declared the United States of America, Declaration of Independence, meaning they determined the vision of governance, the vision of government, the system of economics that they wanted for the United States of America. And that has something to do with how the United States has fared differently and is now a global power, while Britain is no longer a global power. So Ngugi is telling all of you Africans that Africa was partitioned somewhere in Europe behind a conference table. So-called independence was delivered behind a conference table in European capitals. There's a problem with that. That's what he's saying. And I agree with him. There's a big problem with that. You might say, so Africa never, not a single African country has won its independence. So he wants to start thinking like that. And if you think carefully, you will agree that he's correct.
So moving on from, so-called independence, he also pointed out that language can also be a vehicle for rebellion. And he cites the case of the Declaration of Emergency over Kenya in 1952, that all schools run by patriotic nationalists was taken over by the colonial regime and were placed under district education boards chaired by Englishmen. English became the language of my formal education in Kenya. English became more than a language. It was the language, and all others had to bow to it in deference. So would you call that a surrender, a cultural surrender itself?
It was not surrender. It was a dictatorship imposed upon them. Because what he's saying is that the schools, the nationalistic schools identified by Kenyans who were patriotic and were already talking independence of Kenya and were approaching education in a very different way. The British saw that as a threat, and they shut those schools down and imposed English only as the language of instruction.
Wow. So now you mentioned nationalistic people who thought, okay, we're going to get power. And that's, I want to highlight the fact that there were people amongst us who created the sense of the inevitable position of where we're at. And for that, I will stay still on the language of African literature. I want to read a part where he talked about Leopold Senghor. He said Senghor has now been rewarded by being anointed to a honored place in the French Academy, the institution for safeguarding the purity of French language, because he wrote a book. In Malawi, Kamuzu Banda had erected his own monument by way of an institution, the Kamuzu Academy, designed to aid the brightest pupils of Malawi in their mastery of English. So how is it that we can balk against this if, again, we have black skin and white marks, people wanting to be part of the imperialist class? You have, in the case of Leopold Senghor, who wrote most of his books in French, and you had Kamuzu Banda, a trained doctor in the United Kingdom, going back home and erecting an academy designed to aid the brightest pupils in Malawi in their mastery of English language.
Right. And you see, that's part of the problem. A lack of knowledge, not so much of even language or history, but really ideology, you see, or political economy. So people and with Senghor, there's really no excuse, a person, of that intelligence, you see. And Banda as well, to not realize that it is not because, they speak language or they speak French, because what they're talking about is not so much the beauty of their language, but the associations with development. And development normally is identified with economic accumulation. You see, countries that have built, great cities, great infrastructure, the people have a high standard of living. You see, those are things that are identified with civilization. Instead of deconstructing and knowing that these people had nothing, completely nothing, until they started exploiting the labor of others. So there's some books that people just really need to read. They need to read Eric Williams, for example, right? Capitalism and Slavery. And realize that the quest for accumulation and wealth pushed the British, Europeans, the English, to kidnapped fellow Europeans, Englishmen, and sent them off to North America to work on plantations, to send them to the Caribbean as indentured labor. So even before Africans were enslaved, the Europeans were actually pretty much enslaving fellow Europeans. Although, of course, slavery was much worse, right? Because, at least in the case of indentured labor, there was a time limit. When the indenture period expired, they were freed. In fact, they were given some piece of land, right? Africans were enslaved because they were much more productive, much more efficient, and much cheaper because the children would become enslaved as well. And the period had no limit, you see? So now you're exploiting all this and building up wealth. And that is how you build that infrastructure. That's how you build those cities. That's how you industrialize. And then you carried it on to come to Senghor's country and colonize because you wanted to keep growing that wealth. And you got Senghor's father and grandfather, to work literally for free and to buy the stuff that you manufactured. You see? It had nothing to do with the fact that they spoke French or they spoke English in the case of Kamuzu. So if they were familiar with that history, they would not be venerating the languages of the colonizer who deprived him of the opportunity to build the same wealth that was built in England and in France. You see?
Yes. Yes.
And that's what Ngugi is saying. Of course, he did not lay it out explicitly the way that I just laid out, but he does in his other writings, you see?
Yeah.
So when you have a Kamuzu saying, I want only Europeans to be teaching Malawians in this school, is that going to advance Malawi? No, in fact, you'd be better off saying, okay, I want only Chinese teaching in the school. And I want them to teach Malawians how China was able to transform itself from a backward peasant dominated by European society to where China is today. Teach them in Chinese. I don't mind. I would prefer to have that than have the colonizer teach you nonsense in English, you see, or in French.
What you just said there with regards to the knowledge of history and what has gone before is underscored by a book we've taken on previously.
Absolutely.
With My Brothers, where he says in chapter 5, African History in the Service of Black Revolution, one of the major dilemmas inherent in the attempt by Black people to break through the cultural aspect of white imperialism is that posed by the use of historical knowledge as a weapon in our struggle. So,
always again, by my
side. Okay, I see. So that is brilliantly underscored. And there is another book here where that part is also mentioned. Let me quickly find it. It's here. Yeah. And it's a book where it says, one second, I would find that. Where is it? Okay, yes. It says, and in this book, it says, at the same time that the Africanist blackness of skin was being analyzed, other physical features were also scrutinized and assigned valuation. Africans who appeared more Negroid were regarded as less attractive than those who possessed some Europeanized features. Consider the description of these African heroes in Abevera's 19th century abolitionist novels or The Royal Slave. And that you get from...
I thought you were still wearing the word. I was like, wait, I didn't remember that in this book. Okay, you got me there. That was good. That was good.
That you got from Manufacturing Hate, published by the good comrade himself, Milton Allimadi. Again, it goes to the kind of literature that that's pushed on you. Determines your mindset. And so if we get people, writing in their native languages with the right ideology, of course, because that has to be underscored, with the right ideology, then we might just be on the path to true liberation.
Absolutely. Listen,
What do you say?
I write in English, correct? But I write in English coming equipped with a love of African languages, African culture, African tradition, African music, African food, African clothes, just a love of Africa and its manifestations in all aspects and attributes. You see, I did not have the misfortune of growing up in a colonial period where Africa was attacked as the pathway toward quote unquote civilization. You see, and he's speaking to a generation that had that experience, including himself. You see, so one might say that, maybe he spoke in a unique time in African history. So you see, for example, now with the technology space, you see young people, and I don't know what proportion, but you see young people embracing African history, African culture, wanting to know more, wanting to learn more, sharing more. And you see that there has to be a demand for it because you see a lot of the content generating a lot of traffic. So I think when he wrote, obviously this technology did not exist. So the pessimism that was conveyed in that book was 100% warranted. I would like to ask him, and of course, he would have an answer. He would say, and this one nobody can challenge, it should be not up to young people to be educating themselves on these things. That is the role of the education system in each and every African country. So his argument is still valid, correct? The state, the government that is supposed to create the nurturing environment. China is where China is today because of the Chinese state. Whether you like the system of government or not, that's irrelevant. It is the state that has elevated China to where it is today. Same thing with Japan. It is the Japanese state. Same thing with the Koreas, whether you're discussing North Korea or South Korea. You see, whichever one of the two you prefer, it is a state that has elevated that to that level. Correct?
Correct. Yeah.
But
correct.
If you have African states aping European states, where are they going to lead Africa? Should it be up to young people to be going on YouTube or African Stream or I Never Knew TV to learn about African history, African culture? Think about that. So it's still right. If we had African systems determined that this is the Africa we want to create, we would have come a long, long way since 1960s. But we have a mishmash of confusion, leaders groping around with their eyes closed in darkness. And that's why you see a lot of young people are becoming very rebellious now. Absolutely. And it's either going to be two things. You have to give young people the knowledge that they know is out there, or the young people are going to take matters into their own hands. There's just no two ways about it, you see. The population is growing in all African countries. Africa is very young. The economies are stagnant. You're not producing. You're not producing because you are in a dominated position in the global system. Even though you have the resources, you're not determining how the resources are shared. How much it's sold for, what percentage of the total value of that resource that you're going to keep and retain in Africa. You're not determining that, you see? So either way, things will change. Things will change. It will change, and you want it in a relatively orderly way, or it will change in a chaotic way. And then evolve into some sort of stabilization. But we don't want another 60 years, wasted 60 years of so-called independence.
So one aspect of this very epic book was he highlighted the language of the African theater. I'll read a part here that stood out at me and was funny. He said, early one morning, 1976, a woman from Kamerutu village came to my house and she went straight to the point. We hear you have a lot of education and that you write books. Why don't you and others of your kind give us some of that education in the village? We don't want the whole amount, just a little of it and a little of your time. There was a youth center in the village, she went on, and it was falling apart. It needed group effort to bring it back to life. Would I be willing to help? She asked me, which goes back to the question there you just highlighted, that the role of the state and intellectuals alike and elders within the community to help guide the youth as to what is. Because, yes, maybe the silly ones that we have currently who masquerade themselves as leaders are groping in the dark. The last thing you want is the next generation also groping in the dark. So what do you think, as a playwright yourself, what do you think the role of theater is in the liberation of people?
Oh, it's potentially very effective. But that's why precisely the reason why they shut down that effort that he became engaged in very quickly. You see? And it connects back to the language. Because they had the National Theatre in Kenya. They had the theatre in the university, the University of Nairobi or Kenyatta University. But they did not have a people's theatre. There were no theatres in the rural areas where you could stage well-scripted plays, performances. And that's what he did with his comrade, Michel Mugo, the late Professor Michel Mugo, who just joined the ancestors last year. So they go there, he accepts the challenge. They write a play, the first one, I'll marry when I want. And they write it in the Kikuyu language so that they can perform with just ordinary people, not even professional actors, because they understand the language. And in fact, African people are all dramatists, really. Unless you're born in Europe, even then you will still get a little flavor of that from home, if your parents are there. But if you had a rural experience in Africa, then you have been part of a play. If you sat outside and you listened to the elders tell those stories, and sometimes, perform a little motion too while narrating the story. And then at some point, as a youngster, you also start becoming involved in the dances and the singing and the performance. So they're all natural actors, automatic. They've had rehearsals all their life. So now he comes and he weaves, him and his comrade, Professor Mugo, a play that captures the independence struggle and how the achievement of independence was hijacked by the new black bourgeoisie, the African, the comprador. And that the people understand, because the people know their history. The people know that they themselves, because 1980 is not a very long time, 1970s rather, from where independence joined in the 1960s. So they themselves either participated in the liberation struggle in Kenya as part of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, who were demonized as Mau Mau by British. They either participated, or their relatives participated, or their parents participated. You see? So that is a play that has resonance. That's a play that everybody wants to be a part of in terms of performing and acting. Of course, it becomes very popular very quickly. And now they're about to take it to the theaters in the city, in Nairobi.
In the city.
So now, the well-fed elite and the international community, because Kenya is a major center for international capital. They're going to see this play. So obviously this play is a threat to the managers of the international system, because that's what they are really. These governments, the presidency at that time was President Moi and his cabinet of ministers. All these are managers. They're well-compensated managers, you see, in the global capitalist system. So they see this play as a direct challenge to their authority. They're being exposed, stripped naked. So it's not surprising that they suppress this play. So it shows you the power. Can you imagine if we had a writer like Ngugi, like his comrade, Professor Mughal, in every one of these African countries, taking plays to the masses, you see? That would also impact change in many African countries. So yeah, while it's very disappointing what they did to him, because as you know, ultimately he was arrested,
prison,
detained without any trial or charges, you know,
trial
in a modern society for writing a play and teaching people. Yeah. So it's disappointing, but at the same time it's hopeful because it shows you that there are things that we as Africans can do to intervene in the system which is determined to keep our people ignorant. Because once we empower them with knowledge, then the rest is in their hands. They can make the changes that they need to make.
So, yes, we were closely coming to the end of the program, but I mean, we still got a little while. But if you're finding value in this, do subscribe, join the Patreon, and each one bring one. Yes. So when speaking to what you've just broken down in terms of the fear of the managers, he said it was the British colonialism which destroyed that tradition, the tradition of the public play. The missionaries in their politicizing zeal saw many of our traditions as work of the devil. They had to be brought before the Bible could hold sway in the heart of the natives. The colonial administration also collaborated. Any gathering of the natives needed a license. Colonialism feared its own biblical saying that where 2 or 3 gathered, God will hear their cry. Why should they allow God above or the God within the natives to hear the cry of the people? So it's calling out the hypocrisy of the entire establishment.
Right. Listen. Now you just reminded me of 3 things, and audience also do this research. Kimbangu in Congo, the guy who took the so-called European Christian religion. It's not even European. Monotheism started in Kemet, ancient Egypt, and people do that research. The origins of monotheism, over one God, that evolved in ancient Egypt, right? Well before the birth of Christ, meaning that origination story is itself African. But let me come back to Kimbangu. So he takes this religion that the Europeans claim they're bringing to Africa for the first time, and he Africanizes it in the sense that he weaves in African culture and traditions. And it becomes so popular, it becomes a national movement for liberation. So what do? They try him and lock him up, even condemn him to death. I don't think he was killed. It was just, detained and, died in captivity. Kimpavita, same thing. In ancient Congo, a Portuguese colony, when Congo, Portugal has, the longest colonialism in Africa, way before Berlin Conference. Portugal had already been in Africa for centuries, And he says, and she says, Jesus and therefore God were black, and for that she is burnt on the stage. So you have this other part, but then you have this other part where, and this is a story that a Ugandan comrade told me. I think I've told you this in the past. In his village, Catholicism was big in his village, and he knew this old man. He was the village wise elder, right? Given that respect because he is the fountain of a lot of their history and tradition. And he used to go to church every Sunday, and it was in Latin, right? And then, they had an Africanization movement at one point. So they started praying in the local Luo language. The old man refused to go to church. He says, "What? This is it?" He said, "Now everybody can understand what's being said." It sounded much more spiritually connected and mysterious to him when it was in Latin. But now it's in his own African language. Oh no, this cannot be close to God. You see? So you see what the European has managed to do, right? So I think that just explains to you the challenges that we face. And it reminds you of one of Usman Simbene's movie. I forget whether it's Gwenwa. I think it's Gwenwa, where the character goes to France for a few weeks and then comes back and he's forgotten all the African languages. Like Wolof, he's only speaking the little French he knows. And he wants everybody in the village to speak to him in French.
Yeah, there's a part here I want us to talk on before we wind up. And it's made something in my notes. Let me see. Yeah. He said in the 18th and 19th century, Europe stole our treasures from Africa to decorate their houses and museums. In the 20th century, we can add on the 21st century, Europe is stealing the treasures of the mind to enrich their languages and cultures. Africa needs back its economy, its politics, its culture, its languages, and above all, its patriotic writers.
Yeah.
What's your take?
I think Africa needs a true independence. And of course, we can only have independence if we have writers that are able to show the African youth why they actually are not yet independent. And for that to happen, they need to understand some level of political economy, really, And right now, I'm afraid there are not enough. I think in the 1960s, we had more people teaching the youth political economy. You see? Now, with the global, media platform, social media, we can do that. So that's what the African patriotic writers should be engaged in doing, using this media to show them that the direct connection between your condition of impoverishment and your parents in the rural area and your country's relationship with the global economic system. Why are your parents being kicked off the land that they've tilled for generations, and the land is being given to some so-called foreign investor, and you now have no options? Your parents are elderly, weak, dying off. You have some energy, so you're going to try to cross the Mediterranean. Think about that, because obviously you want to stay alive, and you think if you make it to Europe, you're going to get any job so long as you're being paid in euros, right? It's better than dying on the streets. But we need to teach them that you should not accept that. You should make it impossible for your own government to kick your parents off the land and give it to some so-called investor. There's nothing to invest in unless they want to give your parents compensation. And your parents would take the money but not give up all the land. They would keep some for themselves so they can continue sustaining themselves. But you see, under the global system we have, they want your parents not to have any land at all so that you are forced to sell your labor to this so-called investor. So colonialism is just being recycled, you see? So that's what we need to teach our people, to become much more militant and not accepting of neocolonialism through the current crop of African leaders. So Ngugi and his generation did their part, and we who are still actively writing a lot, we should continue that same approach.
Yes, same approach. And that is Ngugi's Decolonizing the Mind. He also wrote lots of books, actually. That's just one of them. Others would be Homecoming, bunch of essays, Moving the Center, Secure the Base, another Something Torn and New, Writers in Politics, In the Name of the Mother, From the Barrel of a Pen.
Yeah.
And his most recent works, The Language of Languages.
Yes, sir.
And all of these are essays of thought. So his mind is still as sharp as, So I enjoy people to explore his works. But again, the one we looked at today is Neocolonialism, the Last Stage. I said no. Decolonizing the Mind by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So, comrade, again, I can't stress enough appreciation for bringing your thoughts to bear.
My pleasure.
So, until next week, when we come back with our news review, it's from the comrade.
Salute continua. See you next week.
See you next week, and have a lovely week ahead. That's a wrap for this week on the African News Review podcast. We hope you are leaving with a clearer, more truthful picture of Africa. Remember, every story has another side, and we're here to uncover it. Don't forget to join us next Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we continue to challenge the narratives and reclaim Africa's voice. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeing Africa for what it truly is.